welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that everyone's talking about. You can't get anywhere on television or the internet without hearing about so-called systemic racism, so-called white supremacy, so-called white privilege, so-called systemic white racism, on and on and on and on. You can't go anywhere on the internet, the news. It's all in the news. Rioting in the streets, looting in stores, burning down buildings. But I don't want to talk about what's happening in the wider culture. I want to address the situation in the evangelical church. The evangelical Bible-believing church is now caving in and capitulating to the mainstream media narrative that this country is just saturated with racism from top to bottom, that this nation and the people, specifically the white people, are just full of subconscious, unconscious, unknowing, invisible racism all throughout their being, and that they are privileged and they don't even know they're privileged, and they just act and speak as if they're privileged, and they have no sensitivity to other people, and on and on and on and on and on. This is the narrative. Now, that message that we're hearing from ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, on and on and on. The mainstream media, the leading newspapers, the leading television networks are pushing this narrative, as well as the universities and colleges across our country, as well as most local and state governments. And the message to people all over the place is that white people are the problem. They've been the problem ever since the founding of our nation. The nation was born in systemic racism, and it has continued on, and it's still here after 250 years, and that even the Emancipation Proclamation and even the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, did not correct this problem, and we finally have gotten to the point in history, the narrative goes, that we must address this terrible, awful problem. Now, what is it that prompted this terrible, awful problem coming to the surface? Well, supposedly the watershed moment was when this person, George Floyd, was killed or murdered, however they're putting it now, by a policeman. And this brought it all to the forefront. Now, that's the narrative that we're hearing from every area of society today. It's not true, but that's what we're hearing. The statistics don't show that black people are not safe in the United States. Statistics do not show per capita that black people, when they are arrested, are treated any worse than white people per capita when they are arrested. Statistics, the data, the actual evidence shows that 9 black people unarmed were killed last year. 19 unarmed white people were killed by police. Now, when you consider the fact that the black population of males is only 6% of the entire U.S. population, yet they commit almost half of all violent crimes in the United States, you realize that there is a disproportionate amount of police encounters with black males in our society because they're committing most of the crimes. And so in those encounters, there are going to be cases where the police shoot and kill black men. It is not at a higher rate than they shoot and kill white men. It is not at a higher rate than they shoot and kill Hispanic men. It is not at a higher rate that they shoot and kill Asian Americans. It is actually below the average. And so there is no targeting of black men by police and shooting black men by police. There is not a crisis, but if you listen to the narrative, if you listen to the mainstream media, if you listen to the race baiters like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, you would think that it's unsafe for a black person to step outside his house because some white person's going to shoot him or her, or they're going to do some violence against them, some racist motivated violence against them. It is totally nonsense. And this is what Candace Owens, a young black woman, has been trying to explain to people for many, many years now. And they don't want to hear that because that racist, systemic racist narrative occurs most prominently every 4 years. Isn't that amazing? Every 4 years election cycle, it seems like this kind of thinking and talking comes to the forefront. And isn't it a coincidence that every 4 years this happens when people are in an effort to try to get out votes for one party or another? So that's what's happening in our general society. But unfortunately, what's also happening is in the evangelical church, there are now most or a majority of evangelical pastors are buying into that scenario, that unsubstantiated scenario, that uncorroborated scenario. In other words, there is no critical thinking, there is no looking at the statistics, there is no data collecting, there's no pondering and trying to make sense of what actually is happening. The narratives that's being pushed by radical groups like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the radical wing of the Democratic Party, the far leftists, that narrative is now being swallowed entirely by most evangelical pastors. The narrative that says America is systemically racist, that we all have this white supremacy, unconscious or conscious, in our lives, and that white people are the problem, and that black people are not safe in the United States, and black people are being killed by white people, and it's an awful, terrible place to live because of the systemic racism, the in-ground, at the root racism in this country. That narrative, which is a political, it's a partisan, it's an ideology of the far left, that narrative is being swallowed hook, line, and sinker by evangelical pastors. And I'll just give you a few examples. There's a large megachurch in Northville, Michigan called Ward Memorial Church. Huge, large, evangelical Presbyterian church. After the rioting and the looting and the protesting and this whole conversation's coming up again in an election year, the pastor of this large church gets on the internet and says, we're going to have a conversation about racism. It's time that we address this issue. It's time for the church to address this issue. This cannot happen. This is systematic racism. This is systemic racism. This is unconscious racism. White people, they don't even know what they're doing. They're committing crimes against their black brothers and sisters, and they don't even know it. And we have to finally, at this point, address this issue to bring unity into the church. Bought into the whole scenario, instead of looking at the evidence for this charge, this accusation by the activists against America, all of America, white America, people with white skin. Instead of looking at the evidence and examining it and thinking it through, it's bought into totally, hook, line, and sinker. And so the pastor is going to, quote, have a conversation with an inner city African-American pastor. And they're going to dialogue and they're going to talk and they're going to address this problem, this crisis in our church, this racist crisis in our church. He's going to address it. And then he also had a Monday set aside after the sermon Sunday for a day of lament and grieving over systemic racism in the United States and in the white church. Wow. No analysis of the evidence for that. No analysis of the quantity of this happening. It's just assumed that this analysis that we're given by the mainstream media and by the radical leftist groups and Black Lives Matter. In other words, Black Lives Matter makes an accusation against all of white America, and this pastor has bought into the entire narrative and assumes that it's true. It has to be true. Another pastor in the same area, within maybe 10 minutes driving distance, the large megachurch Oak Point in Novi, Michigan, Bob Shylock. He comes on the internet and says, people, we have a problem that we have to face. We have to face this, and we have to solve this problem, and that is systemic racism. And so he gets on there and he says, we're going to spend 4 weeks. We're going to spend 4 weeks. We're going to have a sermon series addressing the systemic white racism in the United States and what we can do to correct it. He said it's time to simply not sit back and be silent. He says now we have to actively do something to stop this terrible, awful problem that we have in our society. Again, no effort to build a case for the people in the church that there is a problem with systemic racism. It's simply assumed. The narrative that you're hearing in the newspapers and on television and on radio and everywhere you turn, that this country of ours, the United States, is a racist, systemically racist, at the root, was founded on racism, was built on racism, and perpetuates racism. That accusation, that charge, is totally unchallenged by any of these pastors. It's simply accepted uncritically, unthinking. It's as if it goes right through the critical faculties of the mind and goes right into the heart. And so it's an awful, terrible crisis that we have to address. Even though there are all these other things in society that are going wrong. We have the terrible sin of abortion. We have the terrible sin of the profaning of marriage with this so-called gay marriage. We have the breakdown of the family. We have the mental crisis. People are having mental breakdowns and schizophrenia and anxiety attacks, and the pressures of the modern secular world, and the Christian worldview is under attack, and the Bible is under attack, and basic decency is being thrown on the ground. All these issues, marriage breakups, over 50% of marriages end in divorce, all these really important, critical issues that need to be addressed. And this pastor at Oak Point Church in Novi, Michigan, he's going to spend 4 weeks browbeating his congregation, his predominantly white congregation, browbeating them into feeling guilty and confessing sins that they've never committed. He's going to browbeat his congregation and try to convince them that even though, as far as they know, they haven't hated anyone for the color of their skin, they haven't discriminated against anyone based on ethnic origins or the color of their skin, even though these people are trying to live for Jesus and follow the Bible's teachings and love your neighbor as yourself and so on, even though they've been trying to do that and he's been teaching them to do that, like many hundreds and thousands of evangelical churches all across our country, even though that, he's going to spend 4 weeks basically beating up on his congregation and telling them they're not even aware of their evil in their heart of racism, and that they are oppressing their black brothers and sisters, and that it's got to stop, and it's evil and it's wicked, and shame on them for doing that, and they need to confess their sins. They need to kneel down on their knees and confess their systemic racism. And it's an abuse. It's a spiritual abuse. It's an abuse of power, and it's a false accusation. It's a false accusation to look at your white brothers and sisters and say, you are guilty for sins that you never committed, and you must confess your sins for sins you've never committed. And even though you cannot even think of one instance or one thought where you hated someone based on the color of their skin, you still have it. Because the narrative that Black Lives Matter tells you is that you have it. That is spiritual abuse. And these pastors of evangelical churches are spiritually abusing their people when they buy into the narrative that their people are racist, evil, bigoted, to the root and core of their heart, and that this problem has to be solved. Instead of looking at the actual evidence, okay, you would think if there's going to be a charge, okay, that white America is racist to the core and it's systematic racism, and our churches, there are some pastors who are saying our churches are the most racist place, the most white place in all of America is on Sunday morning in the church service because it's just full of racism. If that's the case, point out the instances of racism. In other words, if you're the pastor of Ward Memorial Church and you're saying that we have a terrible crisis in our congregation and in our churches worldwide, nationwide, and that we have to address this, okay, bring forth the evidence of that problem. You have to show examples of the problem. You can't just assume the narrative that you're being told is valid and then address the problem from that. If it is true that your congregation is a racist congregation, then you need to address it because there will be evidence for that accusation. There will be instances. There will be times when, for example, in the 60s, where you had black people actually blocked from entering buildings. That's an incident of overt racism. And you can point to it and you say, that has to stop. There were instances where people of color were put to the back of the bus and they couldn't sit up in the front. They had to sit in the back. And the white people had to sit in the front. That happened in the Deep South. That's an instance of real racism. And you can go through the entire society and point out instances of actual, factual racism, okay? Now, today, if you go into this church, for example, like Ward Church in Northville, Michigan, and you have a clipboard and you look for instances of racism, you can go Sunday after Sunday after Sunday and not see or hear or even have any indication that there's any racism. And you can ask people of color who come into the services, is there racism? Did you feel safe here? And they'll say, no, there weren't any instances of racism, and I felt perfectly safe here. These people are kind, loving Christians. They're not racist Christians, okay? But yet, those people today, because of this conversation that the mainstream media is telling us we have to have, those people are feeling guilty because even though they can't think of any racist things they've said or done over their life, they're still guilty because the narrative says they're guilty. And so we need to repent of sins we haven't committed. People, this is insanity. Evangelical pastors, don't do this to your people. This is spiritual abuse. You are abusing people. You don't accuse people and point the finger at people and judge people for sins they haven't done. And you don't tell them that they've done it in their heart, deep down inside their heart, when they can't even find anything in there when they look. This is total hypocrisy and spiritual abuse. One of the problems that evangelical pastors are facing here in the United States is that there's a choice that they're having to make. Because of the actual low level of overt or even inadvertent racism in our churches, because it's so low, because most black people feel very safe and will never encounter any kind of racism in the churches, because it's almost non-existent today, thank God, then when this narrative that is presented to the public in the news media and the far left and the Democratic Party and Black Lives Matter and the race baiters like Al Sharpton, because that narrative says that American white people, especially people in churches, are racist, is so prevalent, it's so widespread, then the evangelical pastor has to make a decision. Okay, what am I going to do with this? I can either look into it and really look at the evidence for this really charge, this accusation, this major accusation against an entire block of people, 150 million people. I think that's the population of the white population in the United States. So I can either look into the evidence and statistics and really do some study and do some homework here and find out if this accusation is true, or I can just buy into it and assume that it is and apologize to people that I'm not sure actually were offended by anything I did or my congregation did. We can all just apologize and do contrition for sins that we probably or aren't even doing. And that shows love to our brothers and sisters of color. And so most evangelical pastors, it seems like, are doing that. That's what they're doing. They're saying, well, I'm not quite sure about the narrative. I don't think that's actually true if you look at the statistics, which it's not. But rather than present the facts to people and rather than try to explain to them that the big, huge narrative in society that we're hearing from all quarters now is false, and that the problem, for example, with the George Floyd situation is police brutality. It's easier to just run with the narrative instead of trying to buck that narrative. In other words, George Floyd died at the hands of police brutality. His death, statistically speaking, is not any greater because he was black than if he were white. Police brutalize people every year. There are bad cops. There's no question about that. There is a thing called excessive force. There's no question about that. Everybody agrees that what happened to George Floyd was terrible, awful, and that the person who's guilty of this, that police officer, deserves to be put away for years and years and years because of his crimes. Excessive force, police brutality. But to assume that he did that out of racism is something that is not in the evidence yet. Now, maybe it will come out. Maybe in court, it'll come out that he was a racist. He had racist posts on the Facebook or whatever. Maybe it'll come out that he is a racist. But right now, the evidence shows a policeman using excessive force, and the issue is police brutality. So if evangelical pastors preach on something, they should preach on a police. It's not fair. It's unjust. Police are brutalizing people, all people, because that's what the statistics show. The statistics show that in an encounter between a white person or a black person, it is better, statistically speaking, for a black person to encounter a policeman than it is a white person to encounter a policeman, because the outcome will usually be better for the black person than the white person, statistically speaking. But see, the narrative that's being pushed in the media, it doesn't matter, because they're already assuming things that are not based on evidence. They're assuming things based on a political ideology, a political agenda. So as evangelical pastors, the question is, okay, am I going to buck the main narrative in our culture right now and risk offending my brothers and sisters in the black community? Or am I going to speak the truth based on evidence and statistics and data and actually think this through and help people in my congregation think about things like this so that we're basing our actions on facts rather than rumors, assumptions, political agendas, ideologies, and peer pressure? No. Most evangelical pastors, unfortunately, that I'm hearing in the news and on the internet, and even denominational structures, all these denominations are coming out with, we support Black Lives Matter. We must deal with this structural injustice, structural racism, systemic racism, white privilege. They're using all the buzzwords. In other words, it's too hard, it's too difficult, it's too tricky to try to walk people through the actual facts on the ground. So what we're going to do is simply not deal with all the evidence, the facts, the data, statistics. That's all boring stuff and it's hard to understand, they say. So what we're going to do, we're just going to buy into that whole narrative and just assume that it's all true. Our church is going to be for Black Lives Matter. Our church is going to be in a crusade against systemic racism, against white privilege, against white supremacy, as if all these things were crises points in our culture, and it's so prevalent, and everywhere you walk around, it's hitting you in the face. No, that's false. These issues are not issues. It's like, for example, this microphone. This microphone is a good microphone. It has a noise level. The noise level is way down. So if you have no sound going into this microphone, it still generates its own noise way, way, way down. So can you say that this microphone has a problem with noise? Well, if you amplify the sound 100 times, you're going to hear that noise way, way down there. But in the normal course of a conversation, you won't hear that noise. It's the same way with, quote, racism in the United States. Are there racists? Yes, there are racists, unfortunately. Is it a systemic problem? No. Can a black person walk out of the door of their home in the morning and feel safe? Yes. As safe as a white person or a Latino person, as an Asian person, this is not a crisis moment. And so I would just warn you, if your pastor, if your denominational leader, if your Christian leader, if the Christian ministry that you follow is starting to talk in terms of systemic racism, white supremacy racism, white privilege, all these buzzwords of the far left and the Black Lives Matter narrative, don't buy into it. It's a false narrative. See the big picture. Look at the information. Look at the data. Don't be fooled by political agendas. And let's pray for our pastors that they don't take the easy way out and just follow the crowd and just repeat the party line and the talking points that they hear, that they actually think through these issues and pray through these issues and address the real problems and address the real sins of our society, not these fake and phantom sins that the news media is pushing. Well, I hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ in Culture.